This is part of my ongoing video series concerning God and the assumption that many people make about God creating all things from nothing, ex nihilo. Later in the series, I describe another kind of theology, which is contradictory to this ex nihilo mainstream view. I describe a God who creates from existing potential and not from nothing. Due to requests and feedback, this particular video is a supplement to my first video on ex nihilo and free will. The traditional assumptions about God and creation include the ideas that God is omnipotent, God is omniscient, including foreknowledge, God is perfectly benevolent, and that God created everything out of nothing, ex nihilo, or God creating out of his own imagination. I am particularly at odds with this last assumption here. In philosophy, it is difficult to argue that free will exists at all, but in particular, I have argued that free will does not exist if all of the previous assumptions about God and creation are true. However, critics of my explanations insist that God, based on these assumptions, can create ex nihilo and also gives free will. They claim that omnipotence and creation ex nihilo does not determine outcomes. A common approach is to point out that the universe appears to have characteristics of freedom or randomness, or at the very least, that freedom can be represented by the concept of randomness. What is being referred to here is a concept that I know and understand. Random or free electron mobility is an interesting parallel, and I would like to address it. In fact, atoms on the periodic table can be used as an excellent illustration in this discussion. In physics, we learn that electrons do not move in a predictable circle, but instead may be found in any random location within a shell or cloud around the nucleus. To make the example of electron location more simple to grasp, let's say that the electron may be located in one of 6 locations: up, down, left, right, front, or back. Again, we can just say 1 through 6. But keep in mind that the logic throughout this presentation remains true for any number of possibilities. I chose 6 because people are familiar with dice and random rolls. So, in this scenario, we have an omnipotent and omniscient God who will create a cube, poof, out of nothing. The numbers rolled thereafter will be a number between 1 and 6. If you think about it, there is an infinite number of possible cubes that God can create. Even if you consider that the potential cubes are identical in size and weight and so forth, eventually the random rolls will not be identical. Allow me to demonstrate. One possible cube, which we can call cube A, may randomly roll a 2 on the first roll and a 6 on the second roll, while another possible cube, cube B, may roll a 2 on the first roll and a 3 on the second roll. If you only look at the first roll, cubes A and B would appear identical, but as I said, subsequent rolls will eventually reveal a different number combination. Hopefully you're still with me here. We are getting to the heart of the issue. The different possible cubes that God can create ex nihilo have different number combinations. God knows what the combination will be for the possible cube he's going to create. The question is, which cube will God create? There is an infinite set of possible cubes. In fact, there is a possible cube which will randomly roll the number 2 10 times in a row. Even though to us it seems statistically unlikely, there is even a possible cube in the infinite set that will randomly roll the number 2 100 times in a row, or a possible cube that randomly rolls in patterns. Every conceivable combination is part of the infinite set of possible cubes that can be created ex nihilo. The point is, if you have a God who's omnipotent and omniscient, and who's creating these cubes out of absolutely nothing, God knows exactly which number combination he's going to get before he even creates it. If God does not want the cube that's going to roll 3, 6, 5, 2, 5, 1, 6, 3, 4, 2, 5, 1, 6, 4, 5, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 1, 1, then he can simply decide not to create that cube. When God foresees potential cubes that he can create, he can decide not to create the ones which will roll number combinations that he doesn't want. Not so random after all, is it? God decides to create a cube with a specific number combination. Likewise, there's an infinite set of possible persons that God could create out of nothing. God, knowing the so-called choices that this individual is going to make beforehand, decides whether or not to create that person. That is why in the introduction video, I explained that in ex nihilo creation, an individual is merely doing what God created that person to do. If God doesn't want a person who he's going to create to make certain choices, then he can simply refrain from creating that individual. And instead, God can create someone who he knows will make choices leading him here. God will get the exact person that God imagined he would get. Each individual is the exact result of God's choosing, and an extension of God's own will. Once you allow this to sink in, you will realize that there are no true interpersonal relationships in this theology. And if God does decide to create the individual who goes down the wrong path, can we blame that individual? Now, I want you to contrast that way of thinking with the idea that there are random individuals or free wills that already exist. God may know what numbers the cubes are going to roll beforehand, but God's foreknowledge does not determine the outcome because he is not deciding to create the cubes from nothing. Let's go back to the ex nihilo view for a moment. It is interesting when I confront those who advocate creation out of nothing with this logic. They do not abandon or even make concessions of the ex nihilo doctrine. Instead, they begin to make compromises either on God's omnipotence or God's omniscience, which is an interesting response. Some suggest that man is a creature who is created with an impulse to do good and an impulse to do evil, and God either doesn't know which way the ball will roll, or God is incapable of creating a creature who is balanced or endowed with characteristics that will lead the creature to do good. Later in my series of presentations, I address the problem of evil. Those who advocate creation ex nihilo use the free will defense, and so do I. The problem is that advocates of creation ex nihilo assume that their theology allows for free will, and they assume that God must create morally fallible creatures in order for them to be free. The problem is that they don't have to be morally fallible if God is creating them out of nothing. Or certainly we shouldn't be as amoral as we are. Believe it or not, the problems with creation ex nihilo and its compatibility with free will run deeper than I have described here so far. It is not sufficient to say that our decisions are made based solely on randomness. We have inherent traits and characteristics. Those who have many children see and experience that each child is different. Even identical twins raised together by the same parents. Also, we respond to our environment. Our characteristics are the greatest factors which determine how we will respond to our environment. As I said, the atoms on the periodic table provide an excellent illustration. By creating a different makeup of the atom, the characteristics change. Let's say that God is going to bring element into existence from nothing. The element he creates ex nihilo is made of atoms of gold, which have 79 protons. Gold has very specific properties which dictate how the atoms respond to outside forces. However, what would happen if God would have created the element with one more proton and some neutrons? You get mercury, which behaves much differently. So if God is creating these from nothing, they will behave predictably based on the characteristics and properties they were created to have. Then you can't condemn lead for sinking in water, and you can't praise helium for rising in air. They are merely doing what God created them to do.